Here's something that'll make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about ancient history. In 1542, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana traveled down the Amazon River and reported seeing massive cities, sophisticated roads, and populations that stretched as far as he could see. For over 4 centuries, historians dismissed him as a liar or a fantasist. They said it was impossible. The jungle was too hostile, too wild for civilization. But here's the twist. Recent technology has proven he wasn't lying at all. Beneath the green canopy, hidden from view for 500 years, there are hundreds of massive earthworks, geometric structures, and evidence of cities that might rival anything built in the ancient world. And some of them might be older than the pyramids. You know that feeling you get when you're lying in bed at night, thinking about how vast the universe is, how much time has passed, how many stories have been lost to history. There's something deeply humbling about realizing that entire civilizations, millions of people with their own dreams, innovations, and struggles, can simply vanish beneath the earth. The Amazon isn't just hiding old structures. It's hiding an entirely different version of human history, one where our timeline of civilization might need to be completely rewritten. Before we dive deeper, I'm curious. Comment 1 if you're watching from the US, 2 if you're anywhere else in the world. I always wonder where this story finds people, and if this kind of deep exploration into forgotten history resonates with you. A quick like helps others discover it too. Now, I want to be upfront with you. This isn't a quick video. For the next hour and a half, we're going to take our time exploring this mystery, the technology that's revealing these hidden cities, the people who built them, what their engineered soil tells us about their knowledge, and why everything we've been taught about the origins of civilization might be missing its earliest chapters. So find a comfortable spot, maybe grab some tea or get settled in bed, because there's no need to hurry. We're going on a journey through time, through dense jungle, and through evidence that changes everything. This is the kind of story that deserves space to breathe, and I think you'll find it's worth every minute. Let's start with what we thought we knew about the beginning of human civilization. But here's the question nobody really wants to ask about these vanished Amazon civilizations. What if they didn't just disappear because of disease and conquest? What if some of them were already struggling before the Europeans ever arrived? It's an uncomfortable thought. We want our ancient peoples to be wise, sustainable, living in perfect harmony with nature. And some of them were. The Terra Preta proves that. Those engineered soils are still enriching the earth after thousands of years. That's not just technology. That's wisdom. But archaeology doesn't always tell comfortable stories. At some sites, researchers have found something troubling. Signs of intensive resource extraction. Areas where the soil shows depletion rather than enrichment. Evidence that forests were cleared faster than they could regenerate. It's subtle, written in layers of earth and pollen records, but it's there. Think of it this way. A civilization's fate is like a building's foundation. If the original builders cut corners, used poor materials out of greed, or ignored structural warnings, the entire structure eventually collapses no matter how beautiful the facade. The ancient Amazonians who enriched the soil created foundations that last millennia. But those who extracted without replenishing, they left only ruins and silence. And there's more. Defensive earthworks. Massive ones. Walls and ditches that required enormous labor to construct. Burned settlements. Archaeological layers showing violent destruction. Even mass graves at some sites. These weren't built to defend against jaguars. War, competition for resources. Conflict between growing populations. The same pattern we see everywhere humans have ever lived. Success breeds more people. More people need more food. More food requires more land. More land means conflict with neighbors who want the same thing. It's almost like karma, isn't it? Not the mystical kind, the practical kind. The kind where actions have consequences, where short-term thinking creates long-term problems, where greed plants the seeds of eventual collapse. Now, we don't know for certain that internal problems brought down any specific Amazon civilization. The disease Holocaust, after 1492, was absolutely catastrophic on its own. 90% mortality would destroy any society, no matter how stable. But the archaeological evidence suggests that at least some groups were already under stress, already dealing with the consequences of their own choices. This pattern repeats itself across human history. Ancient Rome, Maya, Easter Island, civilizations that grew powerful through expansion and extraction, then collapsed when they overreached, and they prioritized short-term gain over long-term sustainability. When the powerful became greedy and the desperate became violent, the sobering truth is this: they had advanced knowledge. They understood engineering, astronomy, agriculture, water management. But knowledge and wisdom aren't the same thing, are they? You can know how to extract resources efficiently while still lacking the wisdom to know when to stop. Every society faces this test. Every generation chooses whether to be ancestors worth remembering or cautionary tales written in abandoned earth. The Amazon peoples who created Terra Preta made that choice. They chose enrichment over extraction. They took poor soil and made it better year after year, generation after generation. 2,000 years later, crops still grow abundantly in their engineered earth. That's the kind of ancestor you want to be. Other sites tell different stories. Stories of consumption without regeneration, of expansion without consideration, of immediate needs prioritized over future consequences. And you know what's truly haunting? We're facing exactly the same test right now. Our civilization has knowledge that would astound the ancient world. We can see our entire planet from space. We can sequence DNA and split atoms. We've mapped the human genome and photographed black holes. Are we any wiser about how to live sustainably? How to balance growth with limits? How to think beyond the next quarter's profits or the next election cycle? The Amazon's silence might be more than a mystery. It might be a warning. What if those vanished civilizations are trying to tell us something? What if every collapsed society in human history is essentially saying the same thing? There are consequences to extraction, to violence, to short-term thinking. Karma written in layers of earth. Cause and effect playing out over centuries. The pattern is clear enough. Societies that treat their environment as an infinite resource eventually discover it's not. Societies that prioritize expansion over equilibrium eventually overreach. Societies where the powerful extract wealth while the masses bear the costs eventually fracture. It's not supernatural punishment. It's just physics. Systems theory. What goes up must come down. What you take out must be replenished or the source runs dry. Build your foundation on sand and it will sink. The ancient Amazonians weren't primitives who couldn't understand these principles. They demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ecology, agriculture, and sustainability. Understanding and practicing are different things. Just like we understand climate change, resource depletion, and ecosystem collapse, but here we are, still debating whether to act. Every generation thinks it's different, that the old rules don't apply, that technology will save us, or that collapse happens to other people in other times. The ruins in the Amazon suggest otherwise. Smart people, advanced people, people who understood their world, they still fell when they made the wrong choices. So maybe the real question isn't whether ancient Amazon civilizations were older than Sumer. Maybe it's whether they were wiser, and whether we're any wiser than they were. Because knowledge without wisdom is just a faster route to the same destination. You can build impressive earthworks and still deplete your soil. You can create vast trade networks and still fight destructive wars. You can understand astronomical cycles and still fail to see the cycles in your own society that lead to collapse. The karma written in abandoned earth is simple. Enrich and you'll be remembered in fertile soil. Extract, and you'll be forgotten beneath the canopy. We get to choose which story we tell. Every time we decide between sustainability and exploitation, between long-term thinking and short-term gain, between enriching our foundation and mining it for immediate profit, we're writing the archaeology that future generations might study. Will they find terra preta or depleted soil? Will they see evidence of wisdom or warning signs we ignored? Will they wonder at our achievements or puzzle over our collapse? The Amazon holds more than mysteries about the past. It holds questions about our future. The same test, the same choice, the same karma waiting to be written. The same choice, the same karma waiting to be written. But here's the thing about karma, about consequences. Sometimes they arrive in ways no one could have predicted. Sometimes fate comes from across an ocean. Now, this is where our story takes its darkest turn. Because everything we've been talking about, these sophisticated societies, these engineered landscapes, these centuries of accumulated knowledge, it all came crashing down in what amounts to a historical eye blink. And the weapon wasn't swords or guns. It was something far more devastating. Imagine waking up one morning with a fever. Nothing terrible at first. Just feeling a bit off. But then your neighbor gets sick. Then, their family. Within weeks, half your village is gone. Within months, entire settlements are empty. And here's the truly terrifying part. You don't know why. You've done nothing different. No war has come. No famine has struck. People are simply vanishing. That's what happened across the Amazon basin between 1492 and 1650. Current estimates suggest that 90 to 95% of indigenous Amazonians died during this period. Let that sink in for a moment. 95%. If you had a town of 1,000 people, 50 would survive. If you had a city of 100,000, 5,000 would remain. The killers? Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases that had circulated through European and Asian populations for millennia. Populations that had built up some immunity, paid their dues in countless childhood deaths, and survived. But these diseases had never existed in the Americas. Indigenous peoples had no biological defense whatsoever. And here's what makes it even more catastrophic. These diseases spread faster than the Europeans themselves traveled. Think about it. A Spanish expedition makes contact with a coastal tribe. Some people get sick. That tribe trades with another tribe upriver. More people get sick. Those traders return to their home villages. The disease keeps moving, jumping from community to community along ancient trade routes. The time the next wave of Europeans penetrated deeper into the Amazon, they were arriving at communities that had already been devastated. Places that had lost most of their population before they'd even seen European face. The apocalypse arrived by rumor and cough, not by ship and sword. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant on the ground. Imagine you're living in one of these massive settlements we've been discussing. Your community has been here for generations. You know every path, every garden, every earthwork. You understand the cycles of the floods, when to plant, when to harvest. You know which trees are which fish run, when, which plants heal which ailments. This knowledge isn't written down. It's carried in the minds of your elders, passed down through stories and practice. Now imagine 95% of those minds vanishing within a few generations. The master farmers die before teaching their students. The astronomers who understood the earthwork's alignments die before explaining the patterns. The leaders who knew how to coordinate massive construction projects, how to manage water systems, how to organize thousands of people, gone. In decades, the systems start failing. You can't maintain the raised fields with so few hands. The canals get clogged. The causeways crumble. The forest, which had been carefully managed for centuries, starts reclaiming territory. Fast. Adi. Incredibly fast. This is what happened. A civilization that may have been larger than ancient Sumer, that had engineered vast portions of the Amazon basin, that had created sophisticated agricultural systems and geometric earthworks, it essentially vanished in 150 years. Not disappeared, understand. Vanished. The people didn't go anywhere. They died. Their descendants survived, yes, but in numbers too small to maintain the old ways. Because there were no written records, at least none that survived, entire libraries of knowledge died with the people who carried them. Oral traditions require continuity. They require the chain of speakers to remain unbroken. When 95% of the population dies, that chain shatters. You're left with fragments, pieces of stories, half-remembered practices. Think about what gets lost. Not just how to build earthworks or create terra preta, but the stories behind them. Why this pattern was chosen. What this geometric design represented. The names of the leaders who commissioned these works. The songs that were sung during construction. The philosophical understanding of the world that made these choices feel right and necessary. Gone. All of it. Like a massive library burning down while the only people who knew the cataloging system perished in the flame. Now, here's the historical irony that should make us all pause. When later European explorers pushed into the Amazon interior, what did they find? Dense, unmanaged forest. Small, scattered tribes living in relatively simple conditions. And they concluded, with the confidence of colonizers everywhere, that the Amazon had always been this way. That the jungle was too hostile for complex civilization. That the people here had never developed sophisticated societies. They were looking at a post-apocalyptic landscape and calling it pristine wilderness. They were seeing the aftermath of collapse and interpreting it as the natural state of things. It's like surveying the ruins of Rome 500 years after the fall and concluding that Italy had never supported urban civilization. Francisco de Orellana's accounts of massive settlements suddenly made sense to us only after LiDAR revealed the earthworks. For 4.5 centuries, we dismissed his reports as exaggeration. He wasn't lying. He was describing a world that was already dying even as he traveled through it. Within a generation of his passage, many of those settlements he saw would be abandoned, reclaimed by the forest, erased from memory. That's how quickly complexity can vanish. That's how fragile human knowledge systems truly are. We like to think of civilization as robust, as permanent. We build in stone and steel and tell ourselves these things will last. But civilizations aren't buildings. They're information stored in human minds and human practices. They're knowledge passed from teacher to student. Their skills refined over generations. Break the chain, kill 95% of the people, and all that accumulated wisdom can disappear faster than the buildings crumble. Within 2 or 3 generations, you go from sophisticated landscape engineers to scattered survivors who remember that the old ones built something impressive, but have lost the knowledge of how or why. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? How quickly we could lose everything we think is permanent. The Amazon's green silence isn't just about time and decay. It's about catastrophe. It's about what happens when an entire world ends not with a bang, but with a cough. And perhaps most haunting of all, the Europeans who arrived to find this untouched wilderness never knew that they were walking through a graveyard. So here we stand, looking at evidence scattered across the Amazon basin. And we're forced to ask a question that archaeology doesn't particularly enjoy asking. What do we actually mean when we say civilization? Because carbon dating tells us these Amazon settlements and earthworks are 2,000 to 4,000 years old. Some of that terra preta we talked about. It's pushing back 8,000 years. That's older than Sumerian farming. And Sumer, emerging around 4000 BCE with its cities and cuneiform tablets, has held the title of first civilization in our textbooks for over a century. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The Amazon peoples didn't build with stone. They didn't develop writing systems we found. They didn't leave behind the kinds of cities we're trained to recognize. So, do they count? Let me put it another way. Comparing Amazon and Sumerian civilizations is like comparing a house built from engineered timber with one built from stone. Both require advanced architectural knowledge. Both solve the same problems of shelter and longevity. But if you define advanced buildings strictly by stone construction, you'd miss the wooden structure entirely, even if it was built first and lasted just as long. We've been measuring sophistication with a very particular ruler. Writing systems, monumental stone architecture, dense urban centers. These are the markers we learn to look for, and they're all based on Middle Eastern and Mediterranean models. It's not a conspiracy. It's just that archaeology as a discipline grew up studying Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome. Those became the templates. But what if that template is too narrow? The Amazon peoples engineered soil that's still fertile after 2,500 years. Sumerians developed irrigation, but it eventually salinated their fields into uselessness. Amazon peoples built sophisticated water management systems spanning hundreds of kilometers. The Sumerians did too, granted. But why does stone outlasting wood make one achievement more valid than the other? They created geometric earthworks requiring surveying knowledge and mathematical precision. They supported populations in the millions across a landscape we dismissed as too hostile for complex society. They developed trade networks. They had social hierarchies. They had specialized labor. They had, by any reasonable measure, complex societies. What they didn't have was writing. Or at least, not writing that survived, not writing we found. And this is where our definitions start to crack. Because here's the thing about oral traditions. They can be extraordinarily sophisticated. They can encode botanical knowledge, astronomical observations, historical narratives, legal systems, philosophical frameworks. The Aboriginal Australians maintained oral traditions for over 40,000 years with remarkable accuracy. But because it wasn't written down, we've historically treated it as somehow less advanced. That's a bias worth examining, isn't it? The Amazon peoples built with materials that returned to the earth. They created architecture that worked with their environment rather than dominating it. And 500 years after disease devastated their populations, almost nothing remained visible above ground. If we're honest, that's why we missed them for so long. Not because they weren't there, because they didn't build in the materials our archaeological methods were designed to find. It's like searching for buildings using a metal detector. You'll find every structure with steel beams. You'll completely miss the wooden ones. That doesn't mean the wooden buildings never existed. It means your detection method has a blind spot. Now, I'm not arguing the Amazon was definitely older than Sumer in any simple sense. The dates overlap and intersect in complex ways. Urban Sumer predates large-scale Amazonian earthworks by a couple thousand years. But agricultural sophistication? Terra preta, creation, potentially goes back further. Social complexity? That's harder to measure without written records, but the engineering alone suggests it was there. The real revelation isn't about who was first. It's that we've been asking the wrong question. We've been treating civilization as if it's a ladder with one way to climb. Stone Age, at the bottom. Bronze Age, above that. Writing systems. Urbanization. Empire. As if every society must progress along the exact same steps, and the ones who didn't just weren't advanced enough yet. But what if it's not a ladder? What if it's more like different architectural approaches to the same challenges? The Amazon peoples developed one pathway to social complexity. The Sumerians developed another. The Indus Valley, another. The Nortico in Peru, another still. Each adapted to their environment, their resources, their needs. Some built with stone because they had stone. Some built with earth and wood because that's what they had. Some developed writing for administration and trade. Some maintained knowledge through other systems that served their purposes. Neither approach is inherently superior. They're just different solutions. And here's what makes this more than just an academic debate. It changes how we think about human potential. If there's only one path to civilization, then societies either progress along it or they're primitive. But if there are multiple valid pathways, multiple ways to create sophisticated, sustainable, complex societies, then human ingenuity is far broader than we've imagined. The Amazon peoples thrived for millennia in an environment we still struggle to inhabit sustainably. They developed agricultural techniques we're now trying to recreate. They supported large populations without depleting their ecosystem. That's not primitive. That's mastery. So should we redefine what counts as civilization? I think we already are, whether we realize it or not. Every LiDAR survey that reveals hidden earthworks, every analysis of terra preta, every reconsideration of what advanced actually means is quietly rewriting the definition. We're learning to recognize complexity in different forms, to see sophistication in sustainable systems rather than just monumental architecture, to understand that leaving a light footprint doesn't mean leaving no impact. It might mean leaving the right impact. The Amazon peoples and the Sumerians both created something lasting. Both left evidence of human brilliance. Both solved the fundamental challenge of organizing thousands of people to work toward common goals across generations. That's what civilization is, at its core. Not the writing system or the building material. The coordination. The shared purpose. The accumulated knowledge passed down and built upon. And if we're measuring by that standard, then yes, the Amazon was hiding civilizations as sophisticated as Sumer, just expressed differently, built with different materials, solving different problems, perhaps older in some ways, perhaps not in others, but absolutely worthy of standing in the same conversation. Because in the end, every civilization is just humans figuring out how to live together, leave something behind, and tell future generations, we were here, we built this, we understood our world deeply enough to shape it. Well, the name's enough to shape it. The jungle just made that statement in earth and green, instead of stone and gold. And now, as we piece together this extraordinary story from earthworks and engineered soil, we face an uncomfortable truth. We're running out of time. You know how sometimes you hear a statistic that stops you cold? Here's one. Archaeologists estimate we've documented less than 5% of the potential sites in the Amazon. Less than 5. That means for every ancient earthwork, every settlement, every trace of these sophisticated civilizations that we've found, there are 19 more we haven't even glimpsed yet. The Amazon is like a vast archive library where we've only cataloged the entrance hallway. Each new survey reveals entire wings full of records we didn't know existed. But here's the thing that should make us all pause. The building is on fire from deforestation, and we're racing to photograph and index what we can before the archives are lost forever. It's not a perfect analogy, but you get the sense of it. Discovery and destruction happening simultaneously. And the technology keeps getting better, which is both thrilling and heartbreaking. Every few months, it seems, there's a new LiDAR survey revealing hundreds more sites. Geometric patterns emerging from the data. Causeways nobody knew existed. Settlements that housed thousands. The Amazon keeps offering up its secrets faster than we can properly study them. But deforestation doesn't wait for archaeological documentation. A bulldozer clearing land for cattle doesn't stop because there might be a 2,000-year-old earthwork underneath. The same forest that protected these sites for centuries is being cleared at a rate of about 3 football fields per minute. You can do the math on how many potential archaeological sites are vanishing before we even know they're there. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating, though. We're not working alone anymore. Modern indigenous peoples in the Amazon have been trying to tell researchers something for decades. They've held onto oral traditions, stories passed down through generations about the old ones, about ancient settlements, about places where the forest grows differently because people once lived there. And finally, archaeologists are listening. There's this emerging partnership that gives me genuine hope. Indigenous communities guiding researchers to locations their grandparents spoke of. Traditional knowledge meeting ground-penetrating radar. Stories about sacred earthworks leading scientists to sites they'd have taken years to find otherwise. It's collaboration that should have happened from the beginning, honestly. Because here's what makes this partnership so powerful. Indigenous peoples aren't just pointing to places on a map. They're carrying ecological knowledge that's been tested over thousands of years. They know which palm trees mark old settlements. They recognize soil types that humans modified. They understand the forest as a living record of human presence in ways that no amount of technology alone could reveal. And that brings us to perhaps the most important question. What can we learn? These ancient Amazonians created sustainable civilizations that thrived for over a millennium. They enriched soil instead of depleting it. They managed forests that fed populations in the millions without causing collapse. They built water systems that worked with seasonal flooding rather than fighting against it. We're facing climate change, food security challenges, how to feed billions while protecting ecosystems. And buried in the Amazon might be solutions our ancestors already figured out. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We're desperately trying to innovate our way into sustainable living, while evidence of societies that already cracked that code is literally being bulldozed into oblivion. The potential here is staggering. In the next few decades, if we commit the resources and urgency this deserves, we could completely rewrite human history. Not just add a footnote about some jungle earthworks. I mean fundamentally transform our understanding of how civilization developed, how many times humans independently created complex societies, what counts as advanced culture. But there's this paradox sitting right at the heart of all this. We're discovering evidence of ancient peoples who lived sustainably with their environment for thousands of years. Civilizations that understood their ecosystem so deeply, they could engineer it to be more productive while remaining stable. They left behind terra preta that still enriches the soil today. They created forest gardens that sustained massive populations without destroying the forest itself. And we're making these discoveries while actively destroying that same environment at an unprecedented rate. Think about that for a moment. We're learning about environmental wisdom from the past, while ignoring environmental warnings in the present. We're uncovering proof that humans can thrive for millennia in harmony with tropical rainforests, while clearing those rainforests at record speed. Lessons are emerging from the ground at the exact moment we're ensuring future archaeologists won't find our lessons preserved anywhere except in our rubble. It's like finding the original blueprints for a magnificent building in the basement, while demolishing the building from the top down. Every year, researchers publish new surveys showing hundreds of previously unknown sites. Every year, satellite data shows thousands of acres of Amazon lost to clear cutting. The race is on, and honestly, we are not winning. The urgency here isn't just about satisfying archaeological curiosity. It's not just about filling in gaps in the human story, though that matters. It's about preserving solutions we desperately need. Those ancient engineers figured out how to feed millions sustainably. They mastered water management in one of the most challenging hydrological systems on Earth. They created agricultural methods that improved land rather than exhausting it. That knowledge isn't just interesting. It's potentially crucial for our survival. And here's the thing that keeps researchers up at night. We don't know what we don't know. For every site we've documented, for every technique we've discovered, how many are we losing without ever knowing they existed? What innovations, what sustainable practices, what solutions to problems we're currently struggling with are vanishing into wood chips and cattle pasture? The forest holds answers we haven't even thought to ask about yet. But despite the urgency, despite the destruction, there's still hope. Technology improves every year. Indigenous partnerships grow stronger. More researchers dedicate their careers to this work. Governments, slowly, are starting to recognize the archaeological significance of protecting these areas. We're in this strange moment where the potential for discovery has never been greater, and the threat of loss has never been more immediate. Both things are true at once. The Amazon isn't done revealing its secrets. Every square kilometer of forest likely holds traces of ancient human presence. Every advance in remote sensing technology reveals more. The story is still being written, still being dug up, still emerging from beneath the canopy. We just have to make sure we're not reading the last chapters while burning the book. We just have to make sure we're not reading the last chapters while burning the book. But here's something that sits heavier than unread pages. It's not just the earthworks we've lost, or the cities reclaimed by jungle. It's the voices, the languages, the actual human beings who knew these places intimately, who carried knowledge in their minds that we'll never recover. Think about it this way. Every lost civilization is like a demolished architectural masterpiece. We can analyze the foundation, study the materials used, map where walls once stood, but we'll never walk through those halls, never experience how light fell through the windows, never understand what it felt like to inhabit that intentionally designed space. The floor plan survives, but not the lived experience. And that's what haunts this story. When those populations collapsed after 1492, entire languages vanished. Not just the words themselves, but everything encoded in them. The Amazon peoples had intimate botanical knowledge. They knew which plants healed specific ailments, which combinations created powerful medicines, how to process toxic plants into food. That knowledge was linguistic. It lived in names, in stories, in spoken instructions passed from grandmother to grandchild. When the languages died, the knowledge died with them. We're talking about sophisticated ecological understanding that took thousands of years to develop. How to read seasonal patterns in insect behavior. Which fish spawn where and when. How specific soils interact with specific crops. Modern ethnobotanists work with surviving indigenous peoples and discover that a single elder might know medicinal uses for 300 plants. 300. Imagine what we've lost when entire communities of such experts disappeared. The oral histories. Gone. Think about what that means. These weren't primitive societies with simple stories around campfires. These were complex civilizations with detailed historical narratives. They remembered migrations spanning centuries. They preserved accounts of conflicts, alliances, innovations. They maintained genealogies and property rights, and trade agreements, through spoken tradition. All of it vanished when the speakers died. We have no Amazon equivalent of cuneiform tablets. No hieroglyphs carved in stone. The information storage system was human memory, maintained collectively across generations. It's actually a sophisticated technology. Oral cultures develop specific techniques to preserve information accurately. Rhythm, repetition, association with landscape features. It works. Aboriginal Australians maintained accurate oral histories spanning 10,000 years. But it requires continuous transmission. Break the chain for a single generation, and it's gone forever. Artistic traditions will never witness. The music. Can you imagine the songs that accompanied those massive earthwork projects? The ceremonial music played in those geometric centers? We find ceramic fragments with intricate designs, but we'll never know what stories those patterns told. We see evidence of elaborate featherwork, body painting, textile weaving. But the aesthetic principles behind them, the cultural meanings, the philosophical worldviews they expressed, silent. This is what kills me about studying these sites. Every piece of evidence is testimony from people who can't explain themselves. It's like being given a photo album from a stranger's life. You see faces, places, moments frozen in time, but without captions, without context, you're left guessing at the stories behind every image. Archaeologists become translators for the silent. We interpret intentions from artifacts. We infer belief systems from burial practices. We reconstruct social structures from the distribution of fancy pottery. It's detective work with half the evidence missing and no witnesses to interview. And there's an ethical weight to it. These were real people. They had hopes, fears, relationships, interior lives, as rich as yours or mine. Now we dig through their belongings like we're sorting through an estate sale. We're trying to be respectful, trying to honor their complexity, but they can't consent to how we tell their story. They can't correct our misunderstandings. Modern indigenous peoples carry adapted traditions forward. They're not unchanged descendants. No culture remains static for 5 centuries. But they maintain connections to those earlier societies. Some oral traditions survived, altered, but preserved. Some agricultural practices continue. Some sacred sites remain known. There's increasing recognition that archaeology needs to partner with indigenous communities. They're not just sources of information, they're stakeholders with legitimate authority over their ancestors' heritage. That's a relatively recent shift in the field. For a long time, it was just extraction. Take artifacts, take knowledge, put it in Western museums and papers. Now, slowly, it's becoming collaboration. But even with that partnership, so much is irretrievable. Here's the bigger picture though. What humanity loses when any civilization falls is unique solutions to universal problems. Every culture develops its own answers to the challenges of being human. How do we organize ourselves? How do we relate to our environment? How do we find meaning? What's worth preserving across generations? The Amazon civilization solved problems we're still wrestling with. They created sustainable agriculture in poor soils. They managed resources across vast territories without centralized states. They integrated human habitation with ecological complexity. Terra Preta alone proves they understood something profound about working with natural systems rather than against them. We need those solutions now. We're facing climate change, biodiversity collapse, the challenge of feeding billions sustainably. And somewhere in the Amazon mud are examples of societies that got it right for thousands of years. The instruction manual died with the speakers. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We can split atoms and sequence genomes and send robots to Mars. But we can't recover the lived wisdom of our own ancestors. Knowledge isn't automatically cumulative. It can be lost. Has been lost. Will be lost again if we're not careful. The archaeologists working in the Amazon describe it as bittersweet. Every new discovery is exciting, more pieces of the puzzle revealing themselves. But each discovery also emphasizes the magnitude of what's vanished. For every site we map, how many have been bulldozed for cattle ranches? For every artifact we catalog, how many context-rich interpretations died with the last speakers? There's a particular melancholy to studying absence. These weren't primitive people who failed to achieve civilization. They were sophisticated societies that built differently, valued differently, succeeded differently than the civilizations that wrote themselves into history books. They were just as ingenious, just as fully human. They're just silent now. And we're left standing in the ruins, holding fragments, trying to honor the weight of vanished voices we'll never hear clearly. Trying to learn from teachers who can't correct our mistakes. Trying to tell stories for people who can't say whether we got it right. It's the most important work we can do. And it's permanently incomplete. That absence echoes through everything we build going forward. Every choice we make about what to preserve, what to study, who gets heard. We're the temporary custodians of human heritage. The Amazon reminds us how easily it can slip through our fingers, like water through a sieve. So what aspect of these lost cultures are you most curious about? Their art, their technology, their belief systems, their daily life? Whatever draws you, remember, you're feeling the pull of human connection across vast time. Desire to know them, even though they're gone. That curiosity is how we honor the vanished voices. By insisting they mattered. By refusing to let silence be the final word. And maybe that's the real reason we keep coming back to these stories, night after night. Why we're drawn to the idea of civilizations hidden beneath jungle canopies, waiting to be found. It's not just about the Amazon, is it? There's something deeply human about the concept of lost. We're captivated by the hidden, the forgotten, the buried. A known pyramid doesn't quite grab us the way a newly discovered earthwork does. Why's that? Part of it, I think, is that lost civilizations remind us how much we don't know. In an age where you can look up almost anything in seconds, where satellite imagery maps every corner of Earth, there's something oddly comforting about genuine mystery. The Amazon whispers that not everything's been figured out yet. Not everything's been cataloged, explained, filed away. Wonder still exists in the world, but it goes deeper than that. These discoveries challenge something fundamental about how we think progress works. We're taught this neat timeline, right? Primitive to advanced, simple to complex, hunter-gatherers to farmers to city builders. A straight line pointing upward. And then you find sophisticated water management systems older than the Great Pyramids. You find engineered soil that's still productive after 2,000 years. You find geometric earthworks requiring mathematics we assume primitive peoples didn't have. It doesn't fit the story we've been telling ourselves. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. Because what these Amazon civilizations reveal isn't that our ancestors were mysteriously advanced. It's that they were, differently advanced. They solved problems we're still struggling with. They built societies that worked with their environment rather than against it. They created things that lasted not because they were carved in stone, but because they enriched rather than depleted. That's a humbling thought, isn't it? We look at our own civilization with its steel and concrete, its technology, its global networks, and we assume we're at the peak. That history has been building toward this moment. But what if that's just another cultural bias? What if the ancient Amazonians looked at their world and thought the same thing? What if every successful civilization feels like the culmination of human achievement? The truth is, humans everywhere have always been ingenious and adaptive. That's the real comfort in these stories. You can drop people in a desert. They'll figure it out. Drop them in the Arctic. They'll thrive. In the Amazon basin, where the rivers rise 30 feet every year, they'll build causeways and raised fields and turn flooding into an agricultural advantage. We're not remarkable because we're modern. We're remarkable because our species has always been this clever, this resourceful, this determined to make a home wherever we find ourselves. There's something peaceful about that realization. But what if we looked at it from a different angle? What if our fascination with lost civilizations is actually about exploring human potential? Think about it. Every time we discover another settlement, another earthwork, another sophisticated system hidden beneath the canopy, we're discovering something about ourselves. We're learning what humans are capable of when we have to solve problems creatively. We're seeing proof that there are multiple paths to complexity, multiple definitions of success, multiple ways to build a lasting society. It's like the Amazon is holding up a mirror, showing us forgotten versions of what humanity can be. And maybe that's why these stories help us sleep. Not because they're restful in themselves, but because they're ultimately about resilience. They prove that humans can create meaning that outlasts them. What we build, whether in earth or wood or story, speaks to the future long after we're gone. The ancient Amazonians are gone. Their languages are silent. Their knowledge is fragmented. But their engineered soil still nourishes plants. Their earthworks still mark the landscape. Their forest gardens still bear fruit. They left something behind that matters. That's what we're really searching for beneath the canopy, isn't it? Evidence that our species can create something lasting. That we're not just consuming and moving on. That it's possible to build in ways that enrich rather than deplete, that sustain rather than exhaust. We need those ancestors. We need to know they existed and thrived and solved enormous challenges. Because if they could do it with hand tools and oral traditions, what's our excuse? Here's the thing about mystery, though. It doesn't just exist to tantalize us. It exists to remind us we're in the middle of the story, not at the end. Every puzzle gradually revealing its answers across generations, each discovery opening new questions. Right now, we've documented less than 5% of potential archaeological sites in the Amazon. 5%. That means there are thousands of earthworks, settlements, and landscape modifications we haven't even seen yet. Thousands of pieces of the puzzle still hidden beneath the canopy. Tomorrow, someone will fly a new LiDAR survey. They'll process the data. And there, emerging from billions of data points, will be another geometric pattern we didn't know existed. Another piece of the story. Another glimpse of what our ancestors accomplished. That's the peaceful satisfaction in all this. We don't need all the answers tonight. Mystery isn't going anywhere. It's been waiting 500 years. It'll wait a little longer. But gradually, persistently, the story is emerging. The Amazon is giving up its secrets. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough. Enough to remind us that the human story is longer and richer and stranger than we imagine. Enough to show us that different societies found different solutions, and some of those solutions were profound. Enough to prove that mystery still exists in a mapped and measured world. And maybe that's the real gift these lost civilizations give us. Not just knowledge about the past, but perspective on the present and hope for the future. Because if humans could create terra preta that enriches soil for millennia, maybe we can learn to build sustainably. If they could manage forests as productive gardens while maintaining biodiversity, maybe we can too. If they could construct societies that worked with flooding rather than fighting it, maybe we can adapt to rising seas. The answers aren't all lost. Some of them are just waiting beneath the canopy, patient as the earth itself. So we keep looking. We keep searching. We keep asking questions about who came before, and what they knew, and how they lived. Not because we're trying to reclaim some imagined past, but because we're trying to imagine a more intentional future. Jungle whispers older than stone. And if we listen carefully enough, maybe it's not just telling us where we've been. Maybe it's showing us where we could go. We're all raised on a certain story about where human civilization begins. You've probably heard it in school, seen it in textbooks. Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. The Sumerians with their cuneiform tablets pressed into wet clay, their ziggurats rising from the desert. Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization. It's presented as fact, as the beginning of the human story written in stone and sand. And for the Amazon? Well, that was something else entirely. The Amazon was wilderness, untouched. A green hell, as early explorers called it. Too hot, too wet, too hostile for anything resembling complex society. Sure, there were indigenous peoples, but we were taught they lived in small, scattered groups, adapting to an environment that would never allow cities, monuments, or the trappings of what we call civilization. Here's the thing though. We've been finding things in the Amazon. Not occasionally. Not in small numbers. We're finding geometric earthworks hidden beneath the canopy. Massive ones. The technology is called LiDAR, and it penetrates through all of those leaves and branches, revealing what's been there all along. Patterns in the earth. Structures. Evidence of planning, of labor, of something we didn't think was possible. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. What if our entire timeline is wrong? Not by a few decades or even a century. What if the story we tell about civilization's beginning is missing its earliest chapters? If, while we were staring at the Mesopotamian desert, the real pioneers were working in the jungle, building something that would vanish so completely, we'd spend thousands of years not even knowing to look for it. It's an unsettling question, isn't it? But let's think about why we missed this for so long. Dense Jungle is archaeology's blind spot. Traditional methods simply can't penetrate that green ceiling. You can't walk through the Amazon and stumble across ancient structures the way you might in Egypt or Greece. Everything is hidden, buried, overgrown. Imagine trying to understand a building's original blueprint when every floor has been remodeled dozens of times. Walls moved, rooms repurposed, the basement completely sealed off. You know there's structure underneath, but the current layout tells you almost nothing about the foundation. That's what archaeologists faced in the Amazon. They couldn't see the blueprint. They couldn't even confirm there was a building. And there's something else. Something less about technology and more about us. Cultural bias. We've looked for civilization's origins in places that look like civilization to Western eyes. Stone monuments, written records, urban centers that resemble, even distantly, the cities we know. The Amazon doesn't offer those clues. It doesn't build in stone. It doesn't preserve in ways we expect. So we assumed it wasn't there. But what if the problem wasn't the Amazon? What if the problem was our definition of what counts? Think about what it means to stand in the rainforest, walking on soil that might cover answers we can't see. A landscape that actively hides its past. Every year, more growth, more layers. The jungle doesn't reveal secrets the way the desert does. Wind doesn't strip away the jungle's surface to expose ancient walls. Rain doesn't carve through sediment to reveal pottery shards. Instead, everything organic returns to the earth. Everything breathable decomposes. Wood rots. Fabric dissolves. Even earthworks can blur and erode, their geometric precision softened by centuries of root growth and seasonal flooding. The Amazon is a landscape of forgetting. Not because nothing happened there, but because the environment itself is designed to recycle, to reclaim, to grow over whatever humans leave behind. It's humbling, really. We build with such confidence, such permanence in mind. But the jungle says, nothing lasts. Everything returns. Give me a few centuries, and I'll erase your monuments as if they never existed. Except we're finding them now. LIDAR technology is changing everything. It's showing us that beneath that endless green, there are patterns. Geometric earthworks covering hundreds of square kilometers. Not random. Not natural. Deliberately planned and constructed by societies we never acknowledged existed. Some of these structures rival the scale of ancient Egyptian or Mesopotamian cities. We've been there the entire time. We just couldn't see them. So we're forced to ask different questions now. Not did complex societies exist in the Amazon, but how complex were they, and how far back do they go? Not was there civilization before Sumer, but what did civilization look like when it developed in an entirely different environment with entirely different materials and challenges? It's a quiet kind of wonder, isn't it? Mixed with a bit of gentle disorientation. Like finding out the house you've lived in your whole life has entire rooms you never knew about. The structure was always there. The architecture was always complex. You just never found the hidden doors. And here's what keeps me up at night. If we were this wrong about the Amazon, what else are we wrong about? What other impossible locations have we dismissed because they don't fit our narrow definition of where civilization could or should arise? We've written off entire regions of the planet as too harsh, too remote, too different. But human beings are adaptable, ingenious. We solve problems. We build in deserts and on mountain seeds and in frozen tundra. Why did we ever assume the jungle would be the exception? The truth is, we're only just beginning to understand what was here. Every new survey reveals more sites, more evidence of planning, of engineering, of societies that managed to thrive in an environment we considered hostile to complex living. And with each discovery, the story of human civilization gets longer, richer, stranger than we imagined. There's something peaceful about that, actually. A reminder that we don't know everything. That mystery still exists in the world. That tomorrow, someone might point a laser through the canopy and find something that rewrites our understanding completely. Again. So if you could choose one impossible location to search for a lost civilization, where would you look? Because here's what the Amazon is teaching us. Impossible just means we haven't looked hard enough yet. It means our tools weren't adequate, or our assumptions were wrong, or we were asking the wrong questions. The jungle whispers older than stone. We're finally learning to listen. And so we arrive at the extraordinary question: how do you see through an entire forest? For decades, archaeologists stared at the Amazon and saw an impenetrable green ceiling. Satellite images showed nothing but unbroken canopy. Ground surveys meant hacking through undergrowth for months, seeing only a few meters ahead. Traditional aerial photography captured leaves, branches, shadows, and nothing of what lay beneath. It was archaeology's ultimate blind spot. You might walk directly over a massive earthwork and never know it existed 5 meters below your feet, hidden under soil and centuries of vegetation. Then came LIDAR, and everything changed. LIDAR, light detection and ranging, fires millions of laser pulses at the ground from aircraft flying overhead. Now, here's where it gets truly fascinating. Those pulses can slip between leaves. They find the tiny gaps in the canopy, the spaces between branches, and some of them reach the actual ground. The system records every bounce, every return signal, from the highest leaf down to the forest floor. Then comes the clever part. The technology filters out billions of data points, all those returns from vegetation, leaving only the returns from the earth itself. What you get is a map of the ground surface, as if the forest simply doesn't exist. It's architectural sonar for a construction site that's been continuously occupied and rebuilt for 10,000 years. You can detect the old foundation walls, changes in elevation, intentional patterns, but you're doing it while the building is still full of tenants and ongoing renovations. The jungle keeps growing, keeps changing, and LIDAR sees right through all of it to the bones beneath. In 2018, researchers ran a LIDAR survey over a section of the Amazon basin in Bolivia. They discovered 81 previously unknown archaeological sites in a single pass. 81 sites that had been there all along, invisible, waiting. Some of these structures covered several square kilometers. They'd been hidden not by burial, not by time, simply by leaves. And when those laser-generated images came back, archaeologists saw something that made them reconsider everything. We're talking about earthworks with perfectly circular forms, squares with sides aligned to cardinal directions, complex patterns of concentric rings. This wasn't random building. This was sophisticated planning and measurement. Someone surveyed this landscape, worked out mathematical relationships, and directed the construction of massive structures with accuracy that rivals modern engineering. All without metal tools, without wheels, without what we typically call advanced technology. The earthworks appeared on the maps like ghosts resolving from fog. Suddenly visible, undeniably there. It's helpful to compare this to X-rays revealing bones we couldn't see through skin. Before LIDAR, we had only the surface, the living forest, the apparent wilderness. Now we can see the skeleton underneath, the structure that's been supporting everything all along. The analogy works on another level too. X-rays revolutionized medicine not by changing bodies, but by changing what doctors could perceive. LIDAR's doing the same for archaeology. Here's what's particularly striking about the Amazon versus other landscapes. In deserts like the Sahara, wind eventually exposes ancient structures. Sand shifts, covers, uncovers. Over centuries, pyramids peek through, pottery scatters across dunes, stone foundations emerge. The desert doesn't actively hide the past, it just shifts it around. But the Amazon actively conceals. Trees root through structures. Vines pull apart stones. Soil bacteria decompose organic materials within decades. The forest doesn't preserve surfaces, it devours them and transforms them into more forest. That's why these sites stayed hidden while Egyptian temples stood visible for millennia. It's not that Amazon civilizations were less sophisticated. They just built in a place that erases rather than preserves. But LIDAR sees through the erasure. It maps the subtle rises and depressions, the engineered terraces, the deliberate patterns that human hands shaped into the land thousands of years ago. Technology reveals what the forest spent centuries concealing. Now we face a different problem entirely. We have more sites than we can possibly excavate. Each LIDAR survey reveals dozens, sometimes hundreds of locations worth investigating. But archaeological excavation is slow, expensive work. You need funding, permits, researchers, equipment, time. Years can pass studying a single site, and the list of discovered but unstudied locations grows longer every time someone flies another survey. It's a wonderful problem in one sense, endless work for future archaeologists, answers waiting in the earth. But it's also frustrating. So much is suddenly visible that was invisible before, and we're racing to understand it all. Thermal imaging from satellites adds another layer to this technological revolution. Different soils retain heat differently. Ancient terra preta, that enriched black earth, has a distinct thermal signature compared to surrounding rainforest soil. Modified earth, centuries-old construction fill, areas where humans concentrated organic matter. They all show up in thermal scans as slightly different temperature. During certain times of day, at particular seasons, these differences become visible from space. Though even without LIDAR, researchers can now identify promising sites for closer investigation. They're reading the land's thermal memory. But here's the irony that should concern us all. We can now map these sites faster than ever before, revealing a lost world of Amazon civilization. And at the same time, deforestation is accelerating. The forest that hid these structures for centuries is being cleared at an unprecedented rate. Some of these archaeological sites will be mapped, catalogued, and then destroyed by bulldozers and chainsaws before any archaeologist ever sets foot on them. We're in a race against two competing forces: the technology to discover the past, and the economic pressures destroying the landscape where that past is written. Think about what that means. After surviving thousands of years hidden beneath the canopy, after outlasting empires and epidemics, after remaining intact through centuries of natural growth and decay, these sites might vanish in the next few decades. Not from natural processes, but from tractors and cattle ranches and soy plantations. The technology that reveals them might ultimately create only an archive of what was lost, a digital record of earthworks that no longer exist in physical form. That's a sobering thought, isn't it? But there's wonder here too. Every new survey, every processed LIDAR dataset, every analyzed thermal image adds detail to a picture that's been blank for so long. We're watching an entire civilization come into focus. We're seeing proof of human ingenuity adapting to one of Earth's most challenging environments and thriving there for millennia. The geometric patterns alone tell us something profound. These weren't random settlements scratching out survival. This was organized society with surplus resources and specialized knowledge. Someone had to understand surveying. Someone had to direct large labor forces. Someone had to maintain these structures across generations. The technology sees through green to reveal human intention, human planning, human achievement hidden in the earth. Tomorrow, another survey might fly. Another dataset might reveal another dozen sites. Another piece of the puzzle might click into place. The jungle kept its secrets for centuries. Now we have the tools to ask it questions. And slowly, carefully, it's beginning to answer. But among those answers emerging from beneath the green canopy, there's a story that's particularly unsettling. Not because it's new, but because it's 480 years old. And we dismissed it completely. In 1542, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana did something nobody had done before. He traveled the entire length of the Amazon River, from the Andes to the Atlantic. It took him 8 months. And when he returned to Spain, he told stories that seemed absolutely impossible. He described cities, not villages. Cities, settlements stretching for miles along the riverbanks, so densely populated that you could travel for days and never be out of sight of human habitation. He described fortified towns, vast plazas, roads connecting communities. He wrote about sophisticated pottery, woven textiles, and organized societies. He estimated seeing populations in the hundreds of thousands. For 450 years, historians filed these accounts under exaggeration at best, fantasy at worst. They assumed Orellana was either lying to impress his sponsors or had succumbed to fever dreams in the jungle. The Amazon, after all, was supposed to be pristine wilderness, a green hell too hostile for complex civilization. Everyone knew that. Except Orellana wasn't lying. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. Because Orellana's accounts weren't dismissed because they were poorly documented. They were dismissed because they contradicted what Europeans wanted to believe about the world. The prevailing view was that true civilization required specific ingredients: stone architecture, written language, metal tools, and most importantly, a landscape that looked civilized to European eyes. The Amazon had none of these things. At least, that's what later explorers found. So Orellana must have been mistaken. Here's what we now understand happened. And it's heartbreaking. When Europeans first made contact with the Americas, they brought more than guns and ambition. They brought diseases: smallpox, autoimmune, measles, influenza, diseases that indigenous peoples had no immunity to whatsoever. These diseases didn't wait politely for conquistadors to arrive. They spread like wildfire, racing ahead of the explorers themselves, traveling along trade routes faster than any army could march. Epidemiologists estimate that between 90 and 95% of the indigenous population of the Amazon died within 150 years of first contact. Think about that percentage for a moment. Imagine if your city lost 9 out of every 10 people within a few generations. What would remain? When Orellana traveled down the Amazon in 1542, he was witnessing these civilizations at or near their peak, just as the first waves of disease were beginning to devastate them. But by the time the next significant European expeditions arrived, decades or even a century later, those cities were gone. Not conquered. Not relocated. Simply gone. And the jungle doesn't wait. Without constant human management, without the millions of hands maintaining raised fields, clearing paths, managing tree growth, the forest reclaims everything. Within 50 years, a thriving settlement can become nearly invisible beneath vegetation. Within a century, it's as if it never existed at all. So later, explorers arrived at coordinates where Orellana described cities and found nothing but dense, unbroken jungle. They called him a liar. They called his accounts fanciful. They invented dismissive terms for what he described. But he was simply reporting what he saw. A construction inspector documenting buildings that would be demolished before anyone else could verify they existed. This pattern explains something else that's puzzled historians for centuries: the legend of El Dorado. You've probably heard of it. Mythical city of gold that drove conquistadors mad with greed, sending them on increasingly desperate expeditions into the jungle. What if El Dorado wasn't mythical at all? What if it was a garbled account, passed through multiple languages and cultural misunderstandings, of real wealthy civilizations? Societies with sophisticated trade networks, valuable goods, organized cities. Not streets paved with gold, perhaps, but certainly prosperous, complex cultures that would have seemed remarkably wealthy to the indigenous peoples who described them to Europeans. By the time anyone went looking with serious intent, those societies had already collapsed from disease. The survivors had scattered. The cities had been swallowed by green. All that remained was the legend, like an echo of a building that no longer stands. And here's the vindication. The archaeological evidence we're finding now matches Orellana's descriptions with eerie accuracy. Those massive geometric earthworks? They're the scale of settlements he described. The distribution of terra preta sites. They align with his accounts of continuous habitation along major rivers. The engineering sophistication of raised causeways and water management. Exactly what you'd need for the population densities, he reported. LIDAR doesn't lie. It turns out, neither did Orellana. This raises an uncomfortable question, doesn't it? What else have we dismissed as myth or exaggeration, simply because the evidence disappeared before we thought to look for it? How many other historical accounts are waiting to be vindicated by new technology or shifting perspectives? The Amazon civilization survived for thousands of years, adapted brilliantly to one of Earth's most challenging environments, and then vanished within a few human lifetimes. Not because they were primitive or unsustainable, but because they encountered diseases they'd never evolved defenses against. And because they built with materials that returned to the Earth, leaving almost nothing for future archaeologists to find. Orellana's accounts were like a time capsule, preserving a snapshot of a world in its final moments before catastrophe. He documented something real, something vast, something complex. But by the time anyone thought to take him seriously, the jungle had already rewritten history, transforming cities into what looked like untouched wilderness. The silence of the forest wasn't evidence of absence. It was evidence of loss. And that changes everything about how we read, not just Orellana's accounts, but dozens of other historical documents that describe sophisticated indigenous societies across the Americas. Maybe they weren't exaggerating either. Maybe they were simply accurate witnesses to civilizations on the edge of collapse, recording one last glimpse before the green closed over everything. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That absence of evidence became evidence of absence. That we mistook the aftermath of apocalypse for primordial wilderness. That we called truthful witnesses liars because we arrived too late to see what they saw. The jungle kept its secrets, but it's beginning to whisper them back to us now, and they sound remarkably like the stories we refuse to believe. Let's pick up right where we left off, with the jungle beginning to whisper its secrets back to us. Because what it's revealing isn't just ancient, it's massive. Over 450 geometric earthworks have been discovered in the western Amazon basin. And we're not talking about modest structures here. Some of these sites cover 13 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire ancient core of Athens. Bigger than many cities that made it into our history textbooks. Now, when you first hear earthworks, you might picture something simple. Maybe some mounds, a few ditches. But these are architectural achievements that rival anything we typically celebrate from the ancient world. Talking about perfect circles, precise squares, complex hexagons, all aligned with mathematical precision across terrain that's anything but flat. Here's what makes it truly staggering. They moved millions of cubic meters of earth to create these structures. Millions. Without metal tools. Without wheels. Without draft animals. Think about that for a moment. Building these Amazonian earthworks is like constructing a modern stadium complex using only hand tools and human labor, while maintaining perfect geometric alignment across kilometers of uneven terrain, all without blueprints, GPS, or even metal measuring tools. The logistics require not just labor, but sophisticated project management across generations. You can't just wake up one morning and decide to move a mountain of dirt. You need planning. You need organization. You need people who understand geometry, surveying, engineering. You need a society stable enough that someone who starts digging a trench can trust their grandchildren will finish it exactly as planned. And the precision? It's unnerving. Some of these earthworks maintain geometric accuracy that wouldn't be achieved in European fortifications for another 1,000 years. We're finding circles that are circular to within a few centimeters across hundreds of meters. That's not accidental. That's mathematics. Carbon dating has given us the timeline now, and it's humbling. These structures were built between 2,000 and 1,000 years ago. Think about what that means. While medieval European peasants were living in wooden huts and working the same fields their great-grandparents worked, Amazonian peoples were engineering landscape modifications on a scale that would make a modern civil engineer pause. It's contemporary with Angkor Wat's sophisticated water management systems. It's contemporary with Cahokia's massive mound complexes in North America. These weren't isolated geniuses. This was a global moment of human ingenuity expressing itself in radically different ways. Now, here's something crucial that changes how we see these sites. They weren't built in virgin forest. The evidence is clear now. Ancient Amazonians didn't conquer hostile wilderness to create these earthworks. They actively managed the landscape for centuries, maybe millennia, before beginning construction. The forest was their building material, their resource, their garden, and they shaped it deliberately. Which raises the most fascinating question we still can't definitively answer. What were these for? The honest truth? We're still debating. Some archaeologists look at the circular structures with their careful orientations and see ceremonial centers, places for ritual, for gathering, for connecting with something larger than daily life. The geometry suggests cosmological significance. These circles and squares might mirror the shapes ancient people saw in the stars in their understanding of the universe's order. Others look at the strategic placement, the ditches and embankments, and see defensive structures, fortifications, evidence of societies large enough and organized enough to need protection from rivals. The earthworks could mark territories, control access, create barriers between competing groups. But there's a third possibility that's harder for us to grasp because it doesn't fit our categories. What if they were something we haven't imagined? What if the purpose was so specific to Amazonian culture and cosmology that we're looking at it with completely the wrong framework? It's like trying to understand a building's function by only studying its foundation. You can see it was carefully planned, masterfully executed, deliberately placed, but you're missing the walls, the roof, the activities that happened inside. You're seeing the structure but not the life. The scale alone tells us something profound about the societies that built these. Moving that much earth requires surplus. You need to feed all those workers. You need them to have time away from subsistence farming. That means agricultural productivity. It means food storage. It means logistics and supply chains and administrative systems to coordinate hundreds or thousands of people across years or decades. In other words, it requires civilization in every meaningful sense, even if it doesn't look like the stone cities we've trained ourselves to recognize. And here's something that should make us reconsider our entire mental image of the ancient Amazon. The engineering sophistication we're seeing rivals anything else being built globally at the same time. The ability to survey and maintain geometric precision across kilometers of jungle. The mathematics required to calculate volumes, plan drainage, ensure structural stability. The organizational capacity to mobilize massive labor forces. These weren't primitive people scratching out survival in a hostile environment. They were accomplished engineers building monuments that have lasted 1,000 years and counting. Some of these earthworks have walls 5 meters high and ditches 11 meters deep. That's a 3-story building dug by hand, maintained for centuries. The effort is staggering. The intention is unmistakable. What's perhaps most striking is what these discoveries do to our assumptions. For decades, the prevailing theory was that tropical rainforests couldn't support large populations or complex societies. The soil was too poor, the environment too challenging, the jungle too overwhelming. Every one of those assumptions is being systematically disproven by what we're finding in the ground. The earthworks aren't scattered randomly. They show clear patterns of connection, of trade routes, of regional organization. They suggest not isolated villages, but networks. Not survival, but prosperity. Not simplicity, but sophistication that we simply refuse to see because it was built from earth and wood instead of stone. These are just the ones we found. Remember, we can only see these because of lidar cutting through the canopy. For every earthwork we've mapped, how many remain hidden? How many have been completely obliterated by deforestation before we ever knew they existed? The Amazon is revealing a history written in earth, in the deliberate movement of soil, in the precise geometry of ditches and mounds, in the sheer ambition of peoples who looked at their landscape and decided to reshape it according to their vision. They succeeded. Their earthworks remain, testifying to capabilities we're only now beginning to acknowledge. And they're forcing us to ask, if they could do this, if they could move mountains without metal, create mathematical precision without instruments, organize societies capable of multi-generational projects, what else did they achieve that hasn't survived? What else did they achieve that hasn't survived? What's the most impressive ancient engineering achievement you think doesn't get enough recognition? Because it's increasingly clear we've been overlooking some of humanity's greatest accomplishments, simply because they happened in places we didn't think to look carefully. Now, while we're marveling at massive earthworks and hidden cities, there's something even more remarkable waiting beneath our feet. Something you can't see with LiDAR. Something that doesn't show up as a geometric pattern from the sky. But it's there, scattered across 10% of the Amazon basin, hiding in plain sight. It's called terra preta, black earth. And it's one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence we have that ancient Amazonians weren't just building on the land, they were building the land itself. Imagine you're a farmer in the Amazon today. You're clearing a patch of jungle, expecting the typical reddish, nutrient-poor soil that characterizes most tropical forests. But then your shovel hits something different. It's dark, almost black, rich and crumbly. You plant your crops there, and they explode with growth. Your neighbors' fields across the way barely produce, yours thrive year after year without depleting. You've just discovered terra preta. And what you're standing on is older than the Roman Empire. Here's what makes this truly fascinating. Regular Amazonian soil is notoriously poor. That's the great irony of rainforest. All that lush growth is basically recycling itself on top of dirt that's nearly useless for farming. The nutrients are in the vegetation, not the ground. Cut down the forest, and you've got maybe a few years before the soil's exhausted. This is why slash-and-burn agriculture exists. You're constantly moving, letting old fields recover while you deplete new ones. But terra preta doesn't work that way. This soil is fundamentally different. It's not depleted tropical earth. It's engineered. And the engineering is so sophisticated that we're still trying to figure out exactly how they did it. The chemistry is deceptively simple. Biochar, that's partially burned organic matter. Bone fragments. Broken pottery. Fish remains. Organic waste. Mix it all in precise ratios, and somehow you create soil that doesn't just feed plants, it actually regenerates itself. The biochar creates a structure that holds nutrients and water. It becomes a home for beneficial microorganisms. The soil improves over time rather than degrading. We've carbon dated some of these deposits. 2,500 years old. Still productive. Still enriching whatever grows in it. Let me put that in perspective using our central analogy here. Regular soil is like natural bedrock. It just exists. It is what it is. But terra preta is like finding that a house's foundation isn't just concrete, but a special engineered material that actually improves with age and nourishes anything planted on it. This is proof of deliberate, sophisticated construction that continues serving its purpose millennia after the builders are gone. The ancient Amazonians didn't just farm the soil, they created the soil. That's not agriculture. That's terraforming. Now, here's where the scale becomes almost impossible to grasp. We're not talking about a few garden plots. Terra preta has been found scattered across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Some patches are small, just an acre or two. Others cover entire square miles. The distribution patterns aren't random. They cluster around what we now recognize as ancient settlement sites. They follow waterways. They connect, like nodes, in a network. Do the math on that, and you start to realize what it means. Creating and maintaining these soil systems across that much territory requires organization. It requires knowledge transmission across generations. It requires millions of people working with a shared understanding of soil chemistry, even if they wouldn't have called it that. This isn't a handful of villages experimenting with composting. This is a civilization-scale technology. And modern farmers know it when they see it. You can identify terra preta sites from aerial photographs because the vegetation grows differently. Taller, darker, lusher, greener, tion. It's like the earth itself is marked with the signatures of people who understood something fundamental about how to live here sustainably. Word, sustainable. That's where this gets really interesting. Because for decades, the narrative was that tropical soils simply couldn't support intensive agriculture. You couldn't have large permanent populations in the Amazon because the environment wouldn't allow it. The soil would fail. The people would have to keep moving or starve. Terra Preta proves that's completely wrong. It proves that with the right knowledge, the Amazon could support millions of people continuously. Not despite the challenging soils, but by transforming them. The ancient Amazonians looked at poor soil and didn't accept it as a limitation. They saw it as raw material. There's a beautiful irony here that I can't help but point out. We, modern civilization with all our scientific knowledge and industrial agriculture, are now desperately trying to recreate what we're calling this primitive technology. Climate scientists are studying biochar as a carbon sequestration method. Agricultural researchers are attempting to engineer terra preta for sustainable farming. We're essentially trying to reverse engineer soil that illiterate jungle farmers made routinely 2,000 years ago. They didn't have chemistry labs. They didn't have peer-reviewed papers. They had observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. And they created something we can't quite replicate. That should make us pause and think. What else did they understand that we've forgotten? What other sophisticated knowledge systems existed that left no written record, no stone monuments, but still transformed the world in lasting ways? Terra Preta is invisible to casual observers, but it's shouting a truth we're only beginning to hear. Complexity and advancement don't always look the way we expect them to look. When you enrich the earth itself, when you create soil that feeds your great-great-great-grandchildren, you're thinking in terms of deep time. You're building infrastructure that outlasts empires. The pyramids are impressive, sure, but they don't feed anyone. Terra Preta is still feeding people today, 25 centuries after its creation. It's functional. It's living. It's working exactly as intended, long after everyone who knew its makers is dust. So, the next time someone talks about primitive peoples living hand-to-mouth in the jungle, barely surviving in a hostile environment, remember the Black Earth. Remember that beneath the forest floor lies evidence of people who didn't just survive, they thrived. They built cities we're only now discovering. They engineered earthworks that rival ancient wonders. And they created soil that would nourish their descendants for thousands of years. That's not primitive. That's wisdom we're still struggling to relearn. If you could have one ancient technology fully explained and revived, what would you choose? Because standing here, looking at what Terra Preta represents, I'd be tempted to choose this one. Not because it's flashy or mysterious, but because it solves one of humanity's most fundamental challenges. How to live sustainably in one place, enriching rather than depleting the world you pass on. The answer, it turns out, has been under our feet all along. But what if the soil wasn't the only thing these ancient people engineered? What if the entire forest itself was their garden? Here's something that'll shift how you see rainforests forever. When botanists conduct surveys in the Amazon, they keep finding something odd. In certain areas, useful plant species cluster together in densities that don't make sense naturally. Brazil nut trees growing in suspiciously perfect groves. Cacao appearing in locations where it shouldn't thrive. Fruit trees congregating like they're attending some kind of botanical conference. At first, scientists assumed this was just coincidence. Random chance. The forest doing its unpredictable forest things. But the pattern kept appearing. Again and again. These weren't random distributions. They were deliberate. The Amazon isn't an untouched natural building. It's more like a vast estate whose groundskeepers vanished 500 years ago. Formal gardens have gone wild. The paths are overgrown. The orchards have spread beyond their original boundaries. But if you know what to look for, you can still see the intentional landscaping beneath the chaos. Think about it. If you abandoned your backyard for 50 years, what would happen? The grass would become meadow. The flower beds would spread. That ornamental tree you planted would have offspring scattered by birds and wind. Someone visiting might think it's wild nature, but you'd recognize your handiwork everywhere. You'd see the skeleton of your design beneath the disorder. That's what we're looking at in the Amazon. Forest gardens. Entire landscapes shaped by human hands, then released back to apparent wilderness. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. Genetic studies of Amazon plant species reveal domestication signatures dating back to 10,000 BCE. That's not a typo. 10,000 years before the Common Era. These people were cultivating and selectively breeding plants, while most of humanity was still hunting and gathering in small, nomadic bands. They weren't just picking fruit from wild trees. They were actively managing the forest's composition, encouraging useful species, discouraging others, creating what we might call wild orchards that look natural, but are anything but. And here's the uncomfortable truth we're only now accepting. When Europeans arrived in the Amazon, they found what they called pristine wilderness. Untouched. Primeval. A green hell where civilization had never taken root. They were wrong. Completely, totally wrong. What they found was a post-apocalyptic landscape. Between 1492 and 1650, an estimated 90% of indigenous Amazon peoples died from Old World diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Entire civilizations collapsed in just a few generations. And when the people vanished, their managed forests began reverting to something that looked wild. But it wasn't wild. It was abandoned. The population estimates for the pre-contact Amazon are staggering. Conservative figures suggest 8 to 10 million people. Some researchers argue for much higher numbers. These weren't scattered hunter-gatherers living in small tribes. These were sophisticated societies with complex social structures, trade networks, and extensive agricultural systems. They just didn't build with stone. This is where our architectural prejudices blind us. When we think ancient civilization, we picture pyramids, stone temples, paved roads, permanent structures that survive millennia. But what if your entire civilization is built from the forest itself? From wood and thatch and earth and living plants? It's the same principle as European managed forests and orchards. Same intentional landscape modification. Just a different aesthetic. A different set of materials. We don't question whether medieval European orchards were advanced agriculture, but we've struggled to recognize the Amazon's forest gardens as equally sophisticated. The concept researchers now use is pre-Columbian urbanization. Cities without stone. Population centers that worked with the forest rather than clearing it entirely. It's a different model of urbanism than we're used to, but it's no less complex. And honestly, it might have been more sustainable. Think about the genius of this approach. Instead of clear-cutting forest to create farmland, you gradually transform the forest into your food system. You don't fight the jungle. You become part of it. You work within its rules while bending it to your needs. The trees provide canopy cover that prevents soil erosion. The diversity of species protects against crop failures. The forest itself becomes your infrastructure, your home, your larder, your pharmacy, your hardware store. It's a fundamentally different relationship with the environment than agricultural civilizations developed elsewhere. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. It might have been working for thousands of years. We know these populations were large and stable. The terra preta we talked about proves they maintained productive agriculture across vast areas. The botanical evidence shows sophisticated plant management. The earthworks reveal complex social organization. This wasn't a struggling society barely surviving in hostile terrain. This was a civilization that had figured out how to thrive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. And then disease came by ship, and it all fell apart. Within a few generations, the knowledge holders died. The young people who would have learned the old techniques died. The population density that allowed specialized knowledge to be maintained died. And the forest, no longer managed, began growing according to its own logic again. But not entirely. Those deliberate plantings from centuries past, their descendants are still there. Those fruit trees still cluster unnaturally. Those useful species still appear in suspiciously convenient locations. The forest remembers what the history books forgot. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? What we've been calling the world's last great wilderness is actually a 500-year-old rewilding project. An unintentional experiment in what happens when humans suddenly stop managing a landscape. And here's where it gets philosophically complicated. Does this change how we should think about rainforest conservation? If the pristine Amazon is actually an abandoned human landscape, does that alter its value? Does it change our responsibility to it? I'd argue it makes conservation more important, not less. Because what we're protecting isn't just ecological diversity. It's also archaeological heritage, cultural memory embedded in tree rings and soil chemistry. The last physical traces of civilizations that vanished almost without record. But it definitely complicates the narrative. The romantic idea of untouched wilderness has always been a myth, anyway. Humans have shaped almost every landscape on Earth. But there's something particularly poignant about the Amazon. A garden so vast that when the gardeners left, we forgot it was ever a garden at all. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Human influence doesn't always look like cities and highways. Sometimes it looks like a forest where the useful trees grow just a little too conveniently close together. Sometimes it's written in the living landscape itself, in ways we're only now learning to read. The Amazon has been trying to tell us its story all along. We just didn't know the language. We were looking for stone and finding wood. Looking for monuments and finding trees. Looking for civilization and finding wilderness. When all along the wilderness was the civilization, just wearing a different face. So let's do something together. Picture your city right now. The buildings, the roads, the bridges and parking structures. Now imagine it's all built from wood and earth instead. No concrete, no steel, no asphalt. 500 years from now, what's left? That's the challenge facing anyone trying to understand what the Amazon once held. Because here's what we've been trained to expect when we think about ancient cities. Stone. Massive, permanent stone. The pyramids. The Colosseum. Angkor Wat. We look at these and think, now what, that's a civilization. But what if that's just one way to build? The Amazon had cities. Real cities. We're finding the evidence in the strangest places, in subtle changes to soil chemistry, in patterns that only make sense from above, in the way water still flows through ancient canals that no one's maintained for 500 years. The difference is, they built with what the forest gave them. Wood that's stronger than you'd imagine. Earth that could be shaped and mounded and engineered. Plant fibers woven into structures that lasted lifetimes. And when those civilizations fell, when disease swept through and populations collapsed, the forest did what forests do. It took everything back. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. We're finding evidence of massive wooden structures, and I mean massive, from soil patterns alone. Archaeologists look at the ground and see darker patches where posts once stood. Compressed earth where floors were packed down by thousands of feet over generations. Chemical signatures showing where cooking fires burned for centuries in the same spots. It's invisible architecture. Buildings that have returned completely to the earth, leaving only their footprints behind. The Santarem culture, for instance. They built a city at the confluence of the Tapajos and Amazon rivers that supported tens of thousands of people. For over a millennium, this place thrived. We know this because the soil remembers. The earth is darker there, richer. The ceramic fragments scattered through multiple layers tell us people lived there continuously, generation after generation. But walk through that area today, you'd see jungle. Denser, overgrown, seemingly untouched jungle. You'd never know you were standing in the remains of a city that was larger than many European settlements of the same period. And here's the thing about tropical environments, they're wet. Seasonal flooding was just part of life. The Amazon basin floods up to 30 feet in some areas, transforming millions of acres from forest floor to shallow sea and back again every single year. So, how do you build a city in that? You build, yup. The ancient Amazonians created raised platform mounds. Artificial islands, essentially. They'd move millions of cubic meters of earth, by hand, remember, no machines, to create elevated surfaces that stayed dry even during peak flooding. These weren't small hills. Some of these mounds covered several square kilometers and stood 20 feet high. On top of these platforms, they built their homes, their gathering spaces, their ceremonial centers. When the floods came, the city became an archipelago. Canals that were roads during dry season became waterways. Causeways connected the platforms, creating an infrastructure that worked in both states, wet and dry. It's sophisticated water management. Reservoirs to store water during dry period. Drainage systems to move excess water away. Raised fields for agriculture that benefited from seasonal flooding rather than being destroyed by it. The whole landscape was engineered. But it was engineered with materials that don't last. Compare this to Southeast Asia. Angkor Wat still stands, massive stone temples that have endured centuries. The wooden cities that surrounded those temples? Gone. Vanished. We know they existed from historical records, but the structures themselves? Returned to the forest, just like in the Amazon. The stone temple survived because stone survives. But that doesn't mean the wooden cities were less advanced, less complex, or less important. It just means they were built from different materials. This is something we have to reckon with when we talk about ancient civilizations. We've created these markers in our minds. Stone architecture equals advanced. Permanent structures equal sophisticated. Writing systems equal intelligent. But these are arbitrary measures. The Amazon civilizations had none of these markers as we traditionally define them. No stone pyramids. No paved Roman roads. No cuneiform tablets. But they engineered entire landscape. They created sustainable agricultural systems that we're only now beginning to understand. They built cities that functioned in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They solve different problems in different ways. That doesn't make them less civilized. It makes them differently civilized. Think about it from their perspective. If you live in a place where wood is abundant and stone has to be quarried and moved over impossible distances, why would you build with stone? If you live in a place where seasonal flooding is inevitable, why would you fight it with permanent structures when you can design with it instead? It's adaptive intelligence. It's working with your environment rather than against it. But here's the cruel truth about organic architecture. It disappears. Wood rots. Plant fibers decay. Earth mounds erode, especially in heavy tropical rains. Within a few generations of abandonment, the forest reclaims everything. Imagine if every building in your city was made from treated lumber and earth. Beautiful, functional, carefully designed. In 500 years, archaeologists would find metal fasteners scattered in the soil, ceramic pipes, maybe some glass fragments, chemical signatures showing where fires burned and where waste was processed. They might conclude you never had complex architecture at all. Not because you didn't, but because your construction materials went back to the earth. That's the Amazon's secret. The civilization was real. The engineering was sophisticated. The cities were enormous. But they were built from rain and memory. And when the people vanished, the evidence vanished with them. What we're left with are echoes, patterns in the earth, soil that's still enriched from ancient habitation, canals that still flow, platform mounds that still rise above the floodline, even though no one's maintained them for 5 centuries. The absence of stone doesn't mean the absence of complexity. It just means we have to look harder. And maybe, just maybe, we need to rethink what we privilege in our definition of civilization. Permanence of materials, or sophistication of society. Monuments that endure, or solutions that work. Because the Amazon civilizations didn't build to impress future archaeologists. Built to live, to thrive, to create communities that lasted not decades, but millennia. The buildings are gone, but the legacy remains, written in earth and water and the forest itself. Cities built from rain, held together by memory, vanished into green, but never truly gone. So they built their cities from what the forest gave them. Earthworks that moved water, soil that remembered, structures that lived and breathed with the seasons. But there's something else hidden in those geometric patterns beneath the canopy, something that speaks to a different kind of knowledge entirely. Because some of those earthworks, they're pointing at the sky. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. When researchers started analyzing the alignments of these massive geometric structures, circles, squares, avenues cutting through the forest, they noticed something. The orientations weren't random. Certain earthworks aligned precisely with solstice sunrises. Others marked equinox positions. We're talking about structures built over 1,000 years ago, laid out with mathematical precision across kilometers of terrain, oriented to track celestial events. Think about that for a moment. These ancient Amazonians were doing something extraordinary. They were building astronomical knowledge into earthworks, creating what amounts to a massive analog computer engineered into the foundation itself. You'd need to understand advanced mathematics. You'd need to grasp long-term celestial mechanics. And then you'd need to create a permanent structure that would calculate and display that information for centuries without any moving parts. No gears. No adjustments. Just earth and sky, and the knowledge to connect them. But here's what makes this even more impressive. Near the equator, tracking seasons is brutally difficult. In places like England, you've got dramatic day-length changes. Winter days that barely stretch 8 hours. Summer days lingering past 9 at night. The sun's position shifts obviously throughout the year. It's relatively straightforward to notice patterns. At the equator, day length barely changes. You get roughly 12 hours of daylight year-round. The sun rises almost directly in the east, sets almost directly in the west, every single day. The clues that northern peoples relied on, those obvious seasonal markers, they're just not there. So how do you track time? How do you create a calendar? You watch the subtle shifts, the slight variations in the sun's position at sunrise, the changing angle of shadows at midday, the movement of stars across the night sky. You need precision. You need patience. You need to observe for years, decades, generations, to establish reliable patterns. And then, you need to encode that knowledge into structures that will outlast any individual lifetime. That's what these earthworks represent. Astronomical observatories built from Earth itself. Calendars you could walk through. Time made visible in the landscape. For the people living in the Amazon basin, this wasn't abstract science. This was survival. Because the Amazon doesn't follow a simple wet-dry cycle. It floods. Massively. Seasonally. Rivers can rise 30 feet. Millions of acres go underwater. And if you're practicing agriculture, if you're feeding thousands or tens of thousands of people, you need to know exactly when that flood is coming. Plant too early. Your crops drown. Plant too late? You miss the fertile window when floodwaters recede and leave nutrient-rich sediment behind. Mess up your timing by even a couple weeks? People starve. So accurate flood prediction wasn't academic. It was life or death. The Amazon's flood cycle doesn't conveniently announce itself with obvious temperature changes or dramatic weather shifts. It's driven by distant rainfall in the Andes, by seasonal patterns that unfold over thousands of square miles. The only reliable way to predict it? Track the sun. Track the stars. Build a calendar so precise you can plan your entire agricultural cycle around it. That takes serious mathematical knowledge. The geometry alone is staggering, maintaining precise alignments across kilometers of uneven terrain. Some of these earthworks cover areas larger than modern city blocks, with multiple elements that need to relate to each other geometrically, while also pointing at specific celestial positions. You can't eyeball that. You need surveying techniques. You need units of measurement. You need the ability to calculate angles and transfer those measurements accurately across distances. It's the same kind of sophisticated planning you see at Stonehenge, or Chaco Canyon, or dozens of other ancient sites around the world where people encoded astronomical knowledge into permanent structures. And here's what strikes me about that pattern. Every major ancient culture, independently, across continents, separated by oceans, developed astronomy. Not because they were copying each other. Because the sky was the most reliable information source available. Weather changes. Rivers change their course. Forests grow and die. But the stars? The sun? They follow patterns so consistent, you can set your entire civilization's clock by them. So people watched. They learned. They built. Now, there's debate in archaeology about some of these alignments. Are they intentional, or are we seeing patterns that aren't really there? It's a fair question. If you've got enough structures at enough angles, some of them will accidentally point at celestial events just by chance. But when you see precision across multiple sites, when earthworks separated by dozens of miles share similar orientations, when the geometry is too exact to be coincidental, that's when you start taking it seriously. And in the Amazon, we're seeing that precision. Structures oriented to capture solstice light at specific angles. Avenues that frame equinox sunrises. Patterns that repeat across the landscape. That's not accident. That's design. That's knowledge passed down and carefully maintained. What gets me is the humility required for this kind of science. You don't learn celestial mechanics in one lifetime. You observe. You record, somehow, even without writing. Maybe through oral tradition, through song, through methods we've lost. You pass that knowledge to your children, who add their observations, who pass it forward again. It takes generations to establish reliable astronomical knowledge. Generations of people watching the sky, trusting that what they're learning matters, believing their descendants will continue the work. And then you encode it into the earth itself. You build it so large, so permanent, that even if the knowledge is temporarily lost, the structure remains. A physical reminder. A tool for relearning. That's thinking beyond your own lifetime. That's building for a future you'll never see. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? These ancient Amazonians, living in a landscape we've dismissed as too difficult for complex civilization, were doing astronomy. Sophisticated astronomy. The kind that requires long-term observation, mathematical precision, and a deep understanding that sky and earth are connected. They weren't just surviving in the jungle. They were reading time itself in earthen rings. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing about all these discoveries. Not just that these civilizations existed, but that they were solving the same fundamental problems every human culture faces. How do we track time, predict seasons, plan for the future? And they solved them brilliantly. Without metal tools, without wheels, without the technologies we've been taught are prerequisites for advancement. They had earth. They had sky. They had knowledge passed through generations. And they built structures that are still pointing at the heavens, still marking time, still waiting to teach us what they knew. The jungle may hide their cities, but it can't hide the stars they watched. Those patterns continue, infinite and patient, turning overhead. Just like they did 1,000 years ago, when people stood in these same earthen rings and read time, written in light. But those patterns in the sky, those careful measurements of time, they meant something very practical down here on the ground. Because if you're going to survive in the Amazon, you need to know exactly when the water's coming. And trust me, the water always comes. Every year, the Amazon basin transforms. We're talking about seasonal flooding that can raise water levels 30 feet or more across millions of acres. Picture that for a moment. 30 feet. That's a 3-story building. Your entire landscape disappearing beneath a slow-moving ocean that arrives like clockwork and stays for months. Most civilizations would look at that and think, impossible. Pack up, move somewhere sensible, build on high ground far away. The ancient Amazonians looked at the same flooding and thought, opportunity. Now, this is where things get truly fascinating. Because what they engineered wasn't just survival, it was a complete reimagining of what agriculture could be in an environment that floods predictably every single year. They built raised fields. Imagine platforms of earth, carefully constructed to sit above the high water mark. These weren't small garden plots. We're finding entire agricultural complexes, kilometers of raised planting surfaces surrounded by canals. During the dry season, you plant on these elevated beds. When the floods come, your crops are safe above the water while the canals fill up and become something else entirely. Fish farms. The same canals that drain your fields during dry months become aquaculture systems when the floods arrive. You're not fighting the water. You're using it. 2 harvests from the same space. One from the earth, one from the water. It's brilliant. And here's the thing that makes archaeologists shake their heads in appreciation. These integrated fish farming systems predate similar techniques in Asia by century. But it gets better. Those flooded canals. They're depositing nutrient-rich sediment. When the water recedes, you've got naturally fertilized fields. Flooding that seems like a catastrophe is actually enriching your agricultural productivity. You're not just adapting to the environment, you're making it work harder for you. It's like building a house that needs to function both on land and as a partially submerged structure, with your entire neighborhood's infrastructure converting from roads to canals and back again every year. You don't fight the water. You design every system to work with and even benefit from the transformation. And they didn't stop at fields and fish. They built causeways, raised roads that stayed above the floodwater. We're finding these elevated pathways stretching for kilometers, connecting settlements, allowing year-round travel and trade, even when the forest floor was 10 feet underwater. Imagine the engineering required to maintain roads that function as bridges for half the year. There's this phenomenon called floating meadows, várzea in Portuguese. During the flood season, grasses and vegetation form thick mats that literally float on the rising water. Ancient Amazonians figured out how to utilize these floating ecosystems. They're not just passive observers of nature, they're actively managing every aspect of their landscape. Compare this to what the Dutch did with water management in Europe, or how Venice built an entire city on wooden pilings in a lagoon. Same principle, humans encountering an environment that seems to say you can't live here and responding with watch us. But the Amazonians were doing this centuries earlier, at scales that rival anything built in the old world. And here's what really gets me. Modern engineers are now studying these ancient solutions. As climate change makes flooding more frequent and severe around the world, we're looking at thousand-year-old Amazon agricultural systems and thinking, maybe we should try that. Raised field agriculture, integrated aquaculture, infrastructure designed to work with water instead of against it. These aren't primitive techniques. They're sophisticated responses to environmental challenges we're only now beginning to take seriously. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon didn't see flooding as a disaster to prevent. They saw it as a predictable cycle to choreograph their entire civilization around. Your calendar isn't just marking time. It's orchestrating when to plant, when to harvest, when to move to raise settlements, when the fish will arrive in the canals. Think about the knowledge required. You need to understand hydrology, soil chemistry, fish behavior, plant cycles. You need engineering to build structures that won't wash away. You need social organization to coordinate labor across an entire region. And you need all of this passed down generation after generation, refined and improved, until it becomes a complete system. This is adaptive genius on a massive scale. But here's what strikes me most. They didn't just survive the flooding. They thrived because of it. The annual inundation that would destroy most civilizations became the foundation of their prosperity. Where we see obstacle, they saw resource. Where we see limitation, they saw possibility. It's a completely different relationship with the environment. Not conquest, not domination, collaboration. The river floods, you build with the flood. The soil is poor, you improve it. The forest is dense, you manage it. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate human ingenuity. And they sustained this for over 1,000 years in some regions. That's longer than most empires last. Longer than the Roman Empire. Longer than the Ottoman Empire. Longer than just about any political structure you can name. Because when your civilization is built on working with natural cycles, instead of trying to overcome them, you build something that can last. The Santarem culture alone supported tens of thousands of people continuously for over a millennium using these techniques. Not by depleting resources, not by fighting the environment, by understanding it so deeply that every flood became a benefit instead of a threat. Standing in that landscape today, even in ruins, you can still see the logic. The slight elevations that were once platforms, the depressions that held water, the pathways connecting everything. It's a designed world, as intentional as any city grid, but following the contours and cycles of nature rather than imposing a rigid pattern on top of it. What's the most impressive example of humans successfully adapting to an environment that seems impossible to live in? Think about that question as you drift off tonight. Think about the engineering required to turn catastrophic flooding into agricultural abundance. Think about civilizations that lasted 1,000 years because they learned to dance with their environment instead of dominating it. The Amazon transformed every year between land and water, dry and flooded, field and canal. And the people who lived there transformed right along with it, building a paradise that floated.